Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, guilty. Mr. Padilla.
Guilty.
Mr. Padilla, guilty. Mr. Paul.
Not guilty.
Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Peters.
Guilty.
Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed.
Guilty.
Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Romney.
Guilty.
Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan.
Not guilty.
Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, guilty. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, not guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Mr. Warnock.
Guilty.
Mr. Warnock, guilty. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, not guilty. That's why we have these things. Unless you had a script. The yeas are 57, the nays are 43.
Yep. The yeas are 57. The nays are 43. 2/3 of the senators present not having voted guilty. The Senate judges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, former president of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the article of impeachment. Presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, former president of the United States, upon one article of impeachment exhibited against him by the House representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charge contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby acquitted of the charge in said article.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, I send an order to the desk.
And the clerk will report.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment bills, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the article against Donald John Trump, adjourn sine die.
And without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned sine die. And could I have order, please? The presiding officer, the acting sergeant at arms will escort the House managers out of the Senate chamber. In order.
President. Mr.
Majority
President,
Leader.
Mr. President, can we have order?
The Senate is not in order, and the Senate will be in order.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection, is so ordered. Does any senator seek recognition? Senator from New York, Majority Leader.
Mr. President, the case of Donald Trump's second impeachment trial was open. Mr. President, can we have order, please?
The Senator is right. The Senate is not in order. Senate will be in order. Senate will be in order. Please take your conversations off the floor.
Thank you, Mr.
Senator from
President.
New York.
The case of Donald Trump's second impeachment trial was open and shut. President Trump told a lie, a big lie, that the election was stolen and that he was the rightful winner. He laid the groundwork for this big lie in the months before the election. He told the big lie on election night, and he repeated the big lie more than 100 times in the weeks afterwards. He summoned his supporters to Washington, assembled them on the ellipse, whipped them into a frenzy, and directed them at the Capitol. And then he watched as the violence unfolded and the Capitol was breached. And his own vice president fled for his life, and President Trump did nothing. None of these facts were up for debate. We saw it, we heard it, we lived it. This was the first presidential impeachment trial in history in which all senators were not only judges and jurors, but witnesses to the constitutional crime that was committed. The former president inspired, directed, and propelled a mob to violently prevent the peaceful transfer of power, subvert the will of the people, and illegally keep that president in power. There is nothing more un-American than that. There is nothing more antithetical to our democracy. There is nothing more insulting to the generations of American patriots who gave their lives to defend our form of government. This was the most egregious violation of the presidential oath of office and a textbook example, a classic example of an impeachable offense worthy of the Constitution's most severe remedy. In response to the incontrovertible fact of Donald Trump's guilt, the Senate was subject to a feeble and sometimes incomprehensible defense of the former president. Unable to dispute the case on the merits, the former president's counsel treated us to partisan vitriol, false equivalence, and outright falsehoods. We heard the roundly debunked jurisdictional argument that the Senate cannot try a former official, a position that would mean that any president could simply resign to avoid accountability for an impeachable offense, a position which in effect would render the Senate powerless to ever enforce the disqualification clause in the Constitution. Essentially, the president's counsel told the Senate that the Constitution was unconstitutional. Thankfully, the Senate took a firm stance, set a firm precedent with a bipartisan vote in favor of our power to try former officials for acts they committed while in office. We heard the preposterous claim that the former president's incitement to violence was protected by the First Amendment. The First Amendment right to free speech protects Americans from jail, not presidents from impeachment. If the president had said during World War II that, quote, Germany should attack the United States on Long Island, we've left it undefended, I suspect Congress would have considered that an impeachable offense. Finally, the defense counsel said that President Trump was not directly responsible for the violence at the Capitol. Quote, his words were merely a metaphor, his directions were merely suggestions, and the violent mob was just a spontaneous demonstration. But wind the clock back and ask yourself, if at any point Donald Trump did not do the things he did, would the attack on the Capitol have happened? There's only one answer to this question. Of course not. If President Trump hadn't told his supporters to march to the Capitol, if he hadn't implored them to come to Washington on January 6th in the first place, if he hadn't repeatedly lied to them that the election was stolen, their country was being taken from them, the attack would not have happened, could not have happened. January 6th would not have happened but for the actions of Donald Trump. Here's what the Republican leader of the Senate said. The mob that perpetrated the, quote, failed insurrection, unquote, was on January 6th was, quote, provoked by President Trump. You want another word for provoke? How about incite? Yet still, the vast majority of the Senate Republican caucus, including the Republican leader, voted to acquit former President Trump, signing their names in the columns of history alongside his name forever. January 6th will live as a day of infamy in the history of the United States of America. The failure to convict Donald Trump will live as a vote of infamy in the history of the United States Senate. 5 years ago, Republican senators lamented what might become of their party if Donald Trump became their presidential nominee and standard bearer. Just look at what has happened. Look at what Republicans have been forced to defend. Look at what Republicans have chosen to forgive. The former president tried to overturn the results of a legitimate election and provoked an assault on our own government. And well over half the Senate Republican conference decided to condone it. The most despicable act that any president has ever committed, and the majority of Republicans cannot summon the courage or the morality to condemn it. This trial wasn't about choosing country over party, even not that. This was about choosing country over Donald Trump. And 43 Republican members chose Trump. They chose Trump. It should be a weight on their conscience today, and it shall be a weight on their conscience in the future. As sad as that fact is, as condemnable as the decision was, it is still true that the final vote on Donald Trump's conviction was the largest and most bipartisan vote of any presidential impeachment trial in American history. I salute those Republican patriots who did the right thing. It wasn't easy. We know that. Let their votes be a message to the American people. Because, my fellow Americans, if this nation is going to long endure, we as a people cannot sanction the former president's Congress. Because if lying about the results of an election is acceptable, if instigating a mob against the government is considered permissible, if encouraging political violence becomes the norm, it will be open season on our democracy. And everything will be up for grabs by whoever has the biggest clubs, the sharpest spears, the most powerful guns. By not recognizing the heinous crime that Donald Trump committed against the Constitution, Republican senators have not only risked, but potentially invited the same danger that was just visited upon us. So let me say this. Despite the results of the vote on Donald Trump's conviction in the court of impeachment, he deserves to be convicted, and I believe he will be convicted in the court of public opinion. He deserves to be permanently discredited, and I believe he has been discredited in the eyes of the American people and in the judgment of history. Even though Republican senators prevented the Senate from disqualifying Donald Trump for any office of honor, trust, or profit under these United States, there is no question Donald Trump has disqualified himself. I hope, I pray, and I believe that the American people will make sure of that. And if Donald Trump ever stands for public office again, and after everything we have seen this week, I hope, I pray, and I believe that he will meet the unambiguous rejection by the American people. 6 hours after the attack on January 6th, after the carnage and mayhem was shown on every television screen in America, President Trump told his supporters to, quote, "Remember this day forever." I ask the American people to heed his words. Remember that day forever, but not for the reasons the former president intended. Remember the panic in the voices over the radio dispatch, the rhythmic pounding of fists and flags at the chamber doors. Remember the crack of a solitary gunshot. Remember the hateful and racist Confederate flags flying through the halls of our union. Remember the screams of the bloody officer crushed between the onrushing mob and a doorway to the Capitol, his body trapped in the breach. Remember the 3 Capitol police officers who lost their lives. Remember that those rioters actually succeeded in delaying Congress from certifying the election. Remember how close our democracy came to ruin. My fellow Americans, remember that day, January 6th, forever. The final terrible legacy of the 45th President of the United States, and undoubtedly our worst. Let it live on in infamy, a stain on Donald John Trump that can never, never be washed away. Mr. President, on Monday, we'll recognize President's Day. Part of the commemoration in the Senate will be the annual reading of Washington's farewell address. Aside from winning the Revolutionary War, I consider it his greatest contribution to American civil life. And it had nothing to do with the words he spoke, but the example it set. Washington's farewell address established for all time that no one had the right to the office of the presidency, that it belonged to the people. What an amazing legacy. What an amazing gift to the future generations. The knowledge that this country will always be greater than any one person, even our most renowned, That's why members of both parties take turns reading Washington's address once a year in full into the record, to pledge common attachment to the selflessness at the core of our democratic system. This trial was about the final acts of a president who represents the very antithesis of our first president and sought to place one man before the entire country, himself. Let the record show, before God, history, and the solemn oath we swear to the Constitution, that there was only one correct verdict in this trial, guilty. And I pray that while justice was not done in this trial, it will be carried forward by the American people who, above any of us in this chamber, determine the destiny of our great nation. I yield the floor.
As expected,
The Republican leader.
January 6th was a disgrace. American citizens attacked their own government. They used terrorism to try to stop a specific piece of domestic business they did not like. Fellow Americans beat and bloodied our own police. They stormed the Senate floor. They tried to hunt down the Speaker of the House. They built a gallows and chanted about murdering the Vice President. They did this because they'd been fed wild falsehoods by the most powerful man on earth. Because he was angry he'd lost an election. Former President Trump's actions preceded the riot were a disgraceful dereliction of duty. The House accused the former president of, quote, incitement. That is a specific term from the criminal law. Let me just put that aside for a moment and reiterate something I said weeks ago. There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. No question about it. The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president. And having that belief was a foreseeable consequence of the growing crescendo of false statements, conspiracy theories, and reckless hyperbole, which the defeated president kept shouting into the largest megaphone on planet Earth. The issue is not only the president's intemperate language on January 6th. It is not just his endorsement of remarks in which an associate urged, quote, trial by combat. It was also the entire manufactured atmosphere of looming catastrophe, the increasingly wild myths about a reverse landslide election that was somehow being stolen, some secret coup by our now president. Now, I defended the president's right to bring any complaints to our legal system. The legal system spoke. The Electoral College spoke. As I stood up and said clearly at that time, the election was settled. It was over. But that just really opened a new chapter of even wilder and more unfounded claims. The leader of the free world cannot spend weeks thundering that shadowy forces are stealing our country and then feign surprise when people believe him and do reckless things. Now, sadly, many politicians sometimes make overheated comments or use metaphors. We saw that unhinged listeners might take literally, but that was different. That's different from what we saw. This was an intensifying crescendo of conspiracy theories orchestrated by an outgoing president who seemed determined to either overturn the voters' decision or else torch our institutions on the way out. The unconscionable behavior did not end when the violence actually began. Whatever our ex-president claims he thought might happen that day, whatever reaction he says he meant to produce, by that afternoon, we know he was watching the same live television as the rest of us. A mob was assaulting the Capitol in his name. These criminals were carrying his banners, hanging his flags, and screaming their loyalty to him. It was obvious that only President Trump could end this. He was the only one who could. Former aides publicly begged him to do so. Loyal allies frantically called the administration. The president did not act swiftly. He did not do his job. He didn't take steps so federal law could be faithfully executed and order restored. No. Instead, according to public reports, he watched television happily, as the chaos unfolded. He kept pressing his scheme to overturn the election. Now, even after it was clear to any reasonable observer that Vice President Pence was in serious danger, even as the mob, carrying Trump banners, was beating cops and breaching perimeters, the president sent a further tweet attacking his own vice president. Now, predictably and foreseeably under the circumstances, members of the mob seem to interpret this as a further inspiration to lawlessness and violence, not surprisingly. Later, even when the president did half-heartedly begin calling for peace, he didn't call right away for the riot to end. He did not tell the mob to depart until even later. And even then, with police officers bleeding and broken glass covering Capitol floors, he kept repeating election lies and praising the criminals. In recent weeks, our ex-president's associates have tried to use the 74 million Americans who voted to re-elect him as a kind of human shield against criticism. Using the 74 million who voted for him as a kind of a human shield against criticism. Anyone who decries his awful behavior is accused of insulting millions of voters. That's an absurd deflection. 74 million Americans did not invade the Capitol. Hundreds of rioters did. 74 million Americans did not engineer the campaign of disinformation and rage that provoked it. One person did. Just one. Now, I've made my view of this episode very plain. But our system of government gave the Senate a specific task. The Constitution gives us a particular role. This body is not invited to act as the nation's overarching moral tribunal. We're not free to work backward from whether the accused party might personally deserve some kind of punishment. Justice Joseph Story, our nation's first great constitutional scholar, as he explained nearly 200 years ago, the process of impeachment and conviction is a narrow tool for a narrow purpose. Story explained this limited tool exists to, quote, secure the state against gross official misdemeanors, end quote. That is, to protect the country from government officers. If President Trump were still in office, I would have carefully considered whether the House managers proved their specific charge. By the strict criminal standard, the president's speech probably was not incitement. However, in the context of impeachment, the Senate might have decided this was acceptable shorthand for the reckless actions that preceded the riot. But in this case, the question is moot because former President Trump is constitutionally not eligible for conviction. Now, this is a close question, no doubt. Donald Trump was the president when the House voted, though not when the House chose to deliver the papers. Brilliant scholars argue both sides of this jurisdictional question. The text is legitimately ambiguous. I respect my colleagues who've reached either conclusion. But after intense reflection, I believe the best constitutional reading shows that Article 2, Section 4 exhausts the set of persons who can legitimately be impeached, tried, or convicted. It's the president, it's the vice president, and civil officers. We have no power to convict and disqualify a former office holder who is now a private citizen. Here is Article 2, Section 4. Quote, the president, the vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, end quote. Now, everyone basically agrees that the second half of that sentence exhausts the legitimate grounds for conviction. The debates around the Constitution's framing make that abundantly clear. Congress cannot convict for reasons besides those. It therefore follows that the list of persons in that same sentence is also exhaustive. There's no reason why one list would be exhaustive, but the other would not. Article 2, Section 4 must limit both why impeachment and conviction can occur and to whom. And to whom. If this provision does not limit impeachment and conviction powers, then it has no limits at all. The House has sole power of impeachment, and the Senate's sole power to try all impeachments would create an unlimited circular logic empowering Congress to ban any private citizen from federal office. Now, that's an incredible claim, but it's the argument that the House managers seem to be making. One manager said the House and Senate have, quote, absolute, unqualified jurisdictional power, end quote. Well, that was very honest, because there is no limiting principle in the constitutional text that would empower the Senate to convict former officers that would not also let them convict and disqualify any private citizen. An absurd end result to which no one subscribes. Article 2, Section 4 must have force. It tells us the President, Vice President, and civil officers may be impeached and convicted. Donald Trump's no longer the president. Likewise, the provision states that officers subject to impeachment and conviction shall be removed from office if convicted. Shall be removed from office if convicted. As Justice Story explained, the Senate, upon conviction, is bound in all cases to enter a judgment of removal from office. Removal is mandatory upon conviction. Clearly, he explained, that mandatory sentence cannot be applied to someone who's left office. The entire process revolves around removal. If removal becomes impossible, conviction becomes insensible. In one light, it certainly does seem counterintuitive that an office holder can elude Senate conviction by resignation or expiration of term, an argument we heard made by the managers. But this underscores that impeachment was never meant to be the final forum for American justice. Never meant to be the final forum for American justice. Impeachment, conviction, and removal are a specific intra-governmental safety valve. It is not the criminal justice system where individual accountability is the paramount goal. Indeed, Justice Story specifically reminded that while former officials were not eligible for impeachment, or conviction, they were, and this is extremely important, still liable to be tried and punished in the ordinary tribunals of justice. Put another way, in the language of today, President Trump is still liable for everything he did while he was in office as an ordinary citizen, unless the statute of limitations is run, still liable for everything he did while he was in office. didn't get away with anything yet. Yet. We have a criminal justice system in this country. We have civil litigation. And former presidents are not immune from being accountable by either one. I believe the Senate was right not to grab power the Constitution doesn't give us. And the Senate was right not to entertain some light-speed sham process to try to outrun the loss of jurisdiction. It took both sides more than a week just to produce their pretrial briefs. Speaker Pelosi's own scheduling decisions conceded what President Biden publicly confirmed: a Senate verdict before Inauguration Day was never possible. Now, Mr. President, this has been a dispiriting time. But the Senate had done our duty. The framers' firewall held up again. On January the 6th, we returned to our posts and certified the election. We were uncowed. We were not intimidated. We finished the job. And since then, we resisted the clamor to defy our own constitutional guardrails in hot pursuit of a particular outcome. We refused to continue a cycle of recklessness by straining our own constitutional boundaries in response. The Senate's decision today does not condone anything that happened on or before that terrible day. It simply shows that senators did what the former president failed to do. We put our constitutional duty first.
President. The senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Take this time to explain why I voted to convict the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, of the articles of impeachment presented by the House of Representatives in regards to the incitement of insurrection. Throughout his presidency, Donald J. Trump has violated his oath of office to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. There are many examples that I could give of how he's violated his oath of office. I could also cite the basis of the first articles of impeachment that were tried last year as violating his oath of office. But by far, Mr. President, the most egregious violation of his oath of office took place in his incitement of insurrection that occurred with the attack on this Capitol on January the 6th. But it started well before January 6th. The seeds were planted a long time ago, and even before the November elections, when President Trump pointed out, when the polls were showing that he might lose in the election, that he would refuse to acknowledge that he would accept the election results if he lost. He didn't say that once before the November elections. He said it on several occasions. Talked about a rigged election, talked about a fraudulent election, talked about the election being taken away from us, the victory, with no evidence of voter fraud. One of the key provisions of our Constitution, of our democracy, is the peaceful transition of power. Donald Trump called that into question prior to the November 3rd elections. Then came the November 3rd elections. And shortly thereafter, Joe Biden was declared to be the winner. Why? Because he had the most votes. most populist votes, over 7 million, but he was declared the winner because of electoral votes, 306 to 232. By the way, the same electoral margin that Donald Trump won 4 years earlier, in which Donald Trump called a landslide. But then came the legal challenges by President Trump. He didn't accept the electoral vote or the declared elections. And he has his right to contest the elections in the court, asking for recounts or asking for challenges. But in every one of those cases, he could not establish widespread fraud that would have changed the results in any one of the states, let alone enough electoral vote changes to change the outcome of the election. But did he stop after he was denied relief in all of those legal challenges? The answer is no. He further contested by trying to inappropriately interfere with state election officials and state public officials, urging them to take action to change the certificated results. Now, we have many examples that during this period of time, he was talking about a fraudulent election, a stolen election, all the different things about raising questions as to the legitimacy of the voices of the people of this nation. We have so many examples of his interference, but we actually have the tape of his conversation with the Georgia Secretary of State that we all heard, and heard how the president tried to intimidate and threaten the Secretary of State of Georgia in order to change the certified election results from the votes of the people of Georgia. Clear examples of how President Trump violated his oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. But that wasn't the end of it. He went to his Department of Justice, believing the Department of Justice is his Department of Justice, not the Department of Justice of the United States of America. Now, let's remember that the Department of Justice had found no widespread corruption. In fact, they had determined this is one of the freest elections, one of the least problem elections that we've had. Didn't stop President Trump from trying to intimidate and order his Department of Justice to conduct an additional investigation to find fraud to overturn the will of the people, once again violating his oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. He continued to do this contrary to his constitutional obligations. Corrupt election, stop the steal, rigged elections, tremendous fraud, all words that he used after the November 3rd election. He knew what he was saying was a lie. He knew there was no widespread fraud, but he continued to use the office of the presidency and his voice to promote the big lie. And he knew his followers would believe it. He knew he could convince his loyal followers to believe that this was a rigged election, a stolen election. Again, compromising our democracy where the will of the people determine who our leaders are. And he knew his followers would be motivated to action because he knew he can motivate his followers. He put himself before the nation, before his responsibilities as President of the United States. He put his own self-interest above his responsibilities under the Constitution of the United States and to the people of this nation. And then he summoned his loyal following to Washington on January 6th. He knew they would come. He knew dangerous people were in the group. He knew the Proud Boys were there, which he had directly said, stand back and stand by. He knew that they were ready for violent action. And then he incited the mob to action on January 6th. We know the words that he used. We saw the videos. It's part of the record of the impeachment trial. We will never surrender. We will never concede. We will stop the stolen election. All words that he had been using during the entire 2020 election cycle, particularly when he thought he was going to lose. But the most damning part of the president's violation of his oath of office, the most serious part, is what he did and did not do after seeing the violence erupt in the United States Capitol, after the Capitol was penetrated, after we saw the violence being committed, where we knew that the members of Congress were in danger. The Vice President of the United States was in danger. The people that work here were in danger. The people, the press, all the people that are in the Capitol legitimately were at danger. We all saw that. And the President of the United States knew of that. And he did nothing to stop the violence. He could have called off his loyalist and told him to get out of the Capitol. He didn't do that. He could have sent in the National Guard in order to protect us. He didn't do that. And he never condemned the participants in this mob in penetrating the Capitol for what they did. I'm going to sort of summarize my feeling about that by agreeing with Representative Liz Cheney, the House Republican Conference Chair, who said on the floor of the House, and let me just quote her statement: "The President of the United States summoned this mob, assembled this mob, and lit the flame of this attack. Everything that followed was his doing. None of this would have happened without the President. The President could have immediately and forcefully intervened to stop the violence. He did not. There has never been a greater betrayal by a President of the United States of his office and his oath to the Constitution." I agree with that. President Trump violated his oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. He violated that. But let's take a look at what he did do after knowing the violence that occurred. His tweet of 2:24 p.m. Now, this is after the Vice President had been removed from presiding in the chamber, after he knew the violence that was taking place in the Capitol of the United States. He was aware of all that. He knew that we had shut down the operations of the House and the Senate, that there was violence taking place within the Capitol, and that his vice president was the target of that attack. And what he tweeted at 2:24 p.m., Mike Pence, I'm quoting the president, Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what he should have been done to protect our country, inflaming the group even more to violence after he knew that it was a violent circumstance. He had known violence had taken place, and we heard, put into the record of the impeachment trial today, Congresswoman Butler's report of Majority Leader McCarthy's conversation, which again is during this period of time. Here we are. The Republican leader in the House of Representatives gets the president on the phone. He says, "Mr. President, we're being attacked. My office is being broken into. We need help. Send the guard. Take care of us." And then President Trump said something like, "Well, it's not my supporters, it's some left-wing group." And Leader McCarthy said, "No, Mr. President, these are your supporters who are doing this." And what did the leader say? What did the president say? "I guess, Kevin, these people are more upset about the election than you are." Here we have the members of Congress in harm's way, and the president is talking about the support for those who are causing the violence, putting his own interest above the safety of the people that he has sworn to protect as our commander in chief. And then at the end of the day, about 6 o'clock, he sends out a tweet that really sums up his feelings about what these people were doing. Now, these are people that came into the Capitol, they killed people, they hurt people, they stole property, they damaged property, they invaded the Capitol of the United States, they hurt law enforcement officers, they hurt all of us, they hurt our democracy. So how does the president sum up the day? His tweet? These are the things that happen when a sacred landslide victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever. Repeating the big lie, saying the day was a day of celebration when it was one of the most bleak days, dark days in the history of our nation. That's what President Trump did, rather than bringing in the National Guard, rather than telling his people to go home, rather than being concerned about the safety of the Vice President or the members of Congress, as the President of the United States should have been doing. He violated his oath of office over and over and over again, pattern of practice that we've seen for so long. It clearly establishes that he incited an insurrection against our country, that the facts included as basis for the articles of impeachment brought to us by the House of Representatives has been proven. The purpose of impeachment is not just the accountability for the president, but also to protect our Constitution, to make sure this conduct never happens again. No one is above the law, including the President of the United States. Everyone who was responsible for the insurrection that occurred on January 6th should be held accountable, from those who broke into the Capitol and caused the harm and damage to the President of the United States who incited the violence. That's why I voted to convict President Trump of the articles of impeachment for inciting an insurrection, and that's why I would have voted to disqualify him from ever holding an office of trust again. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. And can I ask unanimous consent that my entire statement be put in the record?
There's no objection.
Mr. President.
The senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the hallmark of our American democracy is the peaceful transfer of power after the voters choose their leaders. In America, we accept election results even if our candidate does not prevail. If a candidate believes that there is fraud, the courts can hear and decide those issues. Otherwise, the authority to govern is vested in the duly elected officials. Mr. President, on January 6th, this Congress gathered in the Capitol to count the votes of the Electoral College pursuant to the process set forth in the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. At the same time, a mob stormed the Capitol, determined to stop Congress from carrying out our constitutional duty. Mr. President, that attack was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence. Rather, it was the culmination of a steady stream of provocations by President Trump that were aimed at overturning the results of the presidential election. The president's unprecedented efforts to discredit the election results did not begin on January 6th. Rather, he planted the seeds of doubt, many weeks before votes were cast on November 3rd. He repeatedly told his supporters that only a rigged election could cause him to lose. Thus began President Trump's crusade to undermine public confidence in the presidential election unless he won. Early on the morning of November 4th, as the ballots continued to be counted, President Trump claimed victory and asserted that Democrats were trying to steal the election. On November 8th, the day after several media outlets had declared Joe Biden the apparent winner based on state-by-state results, President Trump tweeted, "This was a stolen election." With that, Mr. President, his post-election campaign to change the outcome began. Over the ensuing days and months, the president distorted the results of the election, continuing to claim that he had won, while court after court threw out his lawsuits and states continued to certify their results. President Trump's falsehoods convinced a large number of Americans that he had won and that they were being cheated. The president also embarked on an incredible effort to pressure state election officials to change the results in their states. The most egregious example occurred on January 2nd. In an extraordinary phone call, President Trump could be heard alternating between lobbying, cajoling, intimidating, and threatening the election officials in Georgia. "I just want to find 11,780 votes," he stated, seeking the exact number of votes needed to change the outcome in that state. Despite the president's pleas and threats, the Georgian officials refused to yield to the presidential pressure, as did state officials in other states. In December, President Trump's post-election campaign became focused on January 6th, the day that Congress was scheduled to count the Electoral College votes. Although this counting is a ceremonial and administrative act, it is nevertheless the constitutionally mandated final step in the Electoral College, in the electoral process, and it must occur before a new president can be inaugurated. On December 19th, President Trump tweeted to his supporters, "Big protest in DC on January 6th. Be there, will be wild." In response, some of his campaign supporters changed the date for protest rallies they originally had scheduled to occur after the inauguration to happen instead on January 6th. Having failed to persuade the courts and state election officials, President Trump next began to pressure Vice President Pence to use his role under the 12th Amendment to overturn the election. The president met with Vice President Pence on January 6th, then increased the pressure by tweeting hours later, "If the vice president comes through for us, we will win the presidency." That's what his tweet said. Vice President Pence, however, refused to yield. He issued a public letter on January 6th, making clear that his oath to support and defend the Constitution would prevent him from unilaterally deciding which electoral votes should be counted and which should not. During his speech at the Ellipse on January 6, President Trump kept up that drumbeat of pressure on Vice President Pence. In front of a large, agitated crowd, he urged the Vice President to stand up for the good of our Constitution. I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do, President Trump concluded. Mr. President, rather than facilitating the peaceful transfer of power, President Trump was telling Vice President Pence to ignore the Constitution and to refuse to count the certified votes. He was also further agitating the crowd, directing them to march to the Capitol. In this situation, context was everything. Tossing a lit match into a pile of dry leaves is very different from tossing it into a pool of water. And on January 6th, the atmosphere among the crowd outside the White House was highly combustible, largely the result of an ill wind blowing from Washington for the past 2 months. President Trump had stoked discontent with a steady barrage of false claims that the election had been stolen from him. The allegedly responsible officials were denigrated, scorned, and ridiculed by the president, with the predictable result that his supporters viewed any official that they perceived to be an obstacle to President Trump's reelection as an enemy of their cause. That set the stage for the storming of the Capitol for the first time in more than 200 years. Nearly 30 minutes after the Capitol first came under attack, members of Congress, law enforcement, and everyone else here in the Capitol waited in vain for the president to unequivocally condemn the violence and tell his misguided supporters to leave the Capitol. Rather than demand an end to the violence, President Trump expressed his frustration once again that the vice president had not stopped the vote certification as he had urged. Shortly after the vice president was whisked away from this very chamber to avoid the menacing mob chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," President Trump tweeted, "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done." Instead of preventing a dangerous situation, President Trump created one. And rather than defend the constitutional transfer of power, he incited an insurrection with the purpose of preventing that transfer of power from occurring. Whether by design or by virtue of a reckless disregard for the consequences of his action. President Trump, subordinating the interests of the country to his own selfish interests, bears significant responsibility for the invasion of the Capitol. Mr. President, this impeachment trial is not about any single word uttered by President Trump on January 6, 2021. It is instead about President Trump's failure to obey the oath he swore on January 20th, 2017. His actions to interfere with the peaceful transition of power, the hallmark of our Constitution and our American democracy, were an abuse of power and constitute grounds for conviction. Two arguments have been made against conviction that deserve comment. The first is that this was a snap impeachment, that the House failed to hold hearings, conduct an investigation, and to interview witnesses. And that is true. Without a doubt, the House should have been more thorough. It should have compiled a more complete record. Nevertheless, the record is clear that the President Trump, abused his power, violated his oath to uphold the Constitution, and tried almost every means in his power to prevent the peaceful transfer of authority to the newly elected president. Second is the contention that the First Amendment protects the president's right to make any sort of outrageous and false claims, no matter the consequences. But Madam President, the First Amendment was not designed and has never been construed by any court to bar the impeachment and conviction of an official who violates his oath of office by summoning and inciting a mob to threaten other officials in the discharge of their constitutional obligations. My vote in this trial stems from my own oath and duty to defend the Constitution of the United States. The abuse of power and betrayal of his oath by President Trump meet the constitutional standard of high crimes and misdemeanors. And for those reasons, I voted to convict Donald J. Trump. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. Madam President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Ms. Baldwin.
The Senate now in a quorum call after voting 57 to 43 to acquit the former President Donald Trump. The House impeachment managers are talking to reporters. We'll bring you there live.
The bottom line is that we convinced a big majority in the Senate of our case. I'm very proud of the exceptional hard work of these managers who worked through the night, many nights over several weeks, to make this case to the Senate and to the union. As to, I just want to say, one word about the whole thing about witnesses. We were able to get treated as live under oath testimony, the statement of our colleague, Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler. We were able to get a stipulation to that and get it into evidence today by asking for her as a witness. If you listen to Mitch McConnell and the Republicans who are now hurriedly explaining why they voted not to convict, all of them are hinging it on a legal argument, jurisdictional or some other legal argument that could never be overcome by any number of witnesses. We could have had 5,000 witnesses and Mitch McConnell would be making the same speech, because what he's asserting is that the Senate never has jurisdiction over a former president. And for reasons I don't need to belabor, because a big part of the trial was about this, we reject that completely. It's totally at odds with our history, the Blunt case, the Belknap case, the text of the Constitution, the original intent of the Constitution, the original understanding of the Constitution, the Senate's own precedents, and so on. But in any event, the point is that no number of witnesses demonstrating that Donald Trump continued to incite the insurrectionists even after the invasion of the Capitol would convince them. They wouldn't be convinced. They were hinging it on a matter of law, which we thought we had settled back on Tuesday, of course, when the Senate elected to exercise jurisdiction and to reject that jurisdictional constitutional argument. But it is what it is. Mitch McConnell clearly feels that Donald Trump remains a huge problem for the Republican Party, even if he has been disgraced in the eyes of the country. And that is not my jurisdiction, and I really don't have anything to say about that. I think they will have to deal with the political dynamics within their own party. So we did get Donald Trump at least to admit that he's a former president now. So that's good news. He's not asserting that somehow he's still president, and they're recognizing, at least in a de facto sense, the legitimacy of this presidential election, which of course President Biden won by more than 7 million votes and by a margin of 306 to 232 in the Electoral College. With that, I will close my remarks, and the questions are open for any of us, and I'm going to share the podium with my distinguished colleagues. Okay. Yes, At
the beginning of this proceeding, there's a procedural motion, 5 Republicans broke ranks, they voted on the Rand Paul motion, and there were 6 on the constitutionality. Today there were 7 who broke ranks on conviction. So what's to say if you didn't push harder on witnesses, tried to get someone who could provide shed more light into Donald Trump's thinking, that you couldn't have grown the number of Republican defectors?
All right. Somebody else want to take a shot at that? I thought I addressed that, but anybody else want to? Yes, please, Stacey.
Listen, we heard from the minority leader, Mitch McConnell, that we have proven the case. He said specifically, the House managers have proven the facts of the case. And before we started yesterday, we knew when we rested with overwhelming evidence as to the facts of this case. These all jurors were also witnesses to the crime. They knew specifically what was happening. And then there was, we found additional information about Herrera Butler, which we, on yesterday evening, we decided that we were going to go after. And we got it. We got that information to further amplify what we had already proven there in court. There is no other additional witnesses that were friendly to us that were not there on the screen. The body cameras of the Capitol police officers, how much more resonance would that have given to them than the actual seeing the day of the insurrection? Individuals that others of us would have liked to have called, like the president, who we invited, is in fact the defendant and does not have to testify. Other individuals who may have been there with the president were not friendly witnesses to us and would have required subpoenas and months of litigation. They are still litigating McGahn in Impeachment 1 a year later. And so we believe that we have shown that this president is a disgrace to our country. Mitch McConnell himself said that. These senators have decided to hang their hat
to do
on
something,
jurisdictional grounds.
I'm
which are
still
not based on
operating
evidence, which are not
under the
based on the facts,
pretext
and they will
that
not
they
do
may
that.
not.
We have done our duty to the American
Girls trip.
people.
So therefore,
Speaker Pelosi, not come to you next.
I thought you said the other girls already bought their tickets.
they did.
It had not been my intention.
And Messy Mia just
availability.
posted, something. That's fine. I'm saying yes, but
Of our House
I thought they were gonna do a show today too.
on behalf not only
You know what I'm saying?
of the House of
So
Representatives.
I'm operating
On behalf
under the
of the American
standpoint. I'm still gonna go to the
But I
place
have to say
regardless.
personally on behalf
And
of my grandchildren. to give
I'm still
great
gonna
hope
tape. I'm gonna
and
tape
inspiration
something myself.
in each and every one of you. We could not be prouder
And
of
if and when
patriotic presentation. the
we
clarity in
had
which
that we're
you
doing we're gonna
presented,
do our
and
topics
again,
from today
the
next week in
inspiration that you
Atlanta.
have been to so many people. So I thank you for that. When I see all of them, it reminds me that
That only comes from consistency. That doesn't come from you just posting.
them self-recruiting.
Which is why it was a good idea to start to. But that's neither here nor. That's what I'm saying. I'm not.
Head of my hospital
Honestly, I really think they should have.
department or this or that. And so I have to think about whether I run for Congress. We always say. we
Oh, I
don't
thought
want
so too.
anybody
But they thought it was a good way to
without
kick off. But they don't even know about
That's
kick
why
off
we're
because they get,
looking for
I
you
don't
to
know. They're
run,
just crazy.
because you
But I
have
said all that
options.
to say
That shouldn't
that
be a reason for you not to run. But what we saw
I
in
you'll
that
you'll
Senate today
I was just preparing
was
you
a cowardly
for
group of Republicans
what I'm doing
who apparently have no options
or how I'm gonna do
because
how
they were afraid to defend their job, respect the
yeah.
institution
You ready? You ain't got your
in
shoes on.
which they serve.
Oh yeah, I need to walk. Let her
Imagine
pee.
that it
When
would
she
be
crapped earlier, but she
vandalized
just needs to pee. Hey,
in so many bad
you know what
ways
you
that
ready
won't
to
even
do?
go
Get back
into
in.
here, and that they
Oh
would
yeah,
not
it's true. It's
respect it.
damn true.
That the president of the Senate, Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence, was the chant, and they just dismissed that. Why? Because maybe they can't get another job. What is so important about any one of us? What is so important about the political survival of any one of us that is more important than our Constitution that we take an oath to protect and defend? But why I came over was because I listened to Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell, who when this distinguished group of House managers were gathered on January 15th to deliver the articles of impeachment, we're told it could not be received because Mitch McConnell had shut down the Senate and was going to keep it shut down until the inauguration. So for him to get up there and make this indictment against the president and then say, but I can't vote for it because it's after the fact that he established that it could not be delivered before the inauguration. Now, when you think about January 6th, between January 6th and January 20th, you're only talking about just under 2 weeks, a day under 2 weeks. So the big lie, stop the steal, the big lie that you talked about, stop the steal, was the momentum for getting these people there on the 6th. They honestly believe, for whatever reason, maybe too much social media, whatever. Watch Social Media, that movie. Why they were thinking that was true, that the election was not legitimate, whatever the reason the president told them. So, okay, so that's the 6th. A week later, we impeach in the House. Thank you to those of you who participated right away. Jamie Raskin, Ted Lieu, and David Cicilline. They had it all written up and ready to go. Bipartisanly passed the House, and then 2 days later, ready with the case to take to the Senate. Oh, we can't receive it. Not a question, and then by the law, you're supposed to receive it and the next day start the trial. So for Mitch McConnell, who created the situation where it could not have been heard
before the 20th, or even begun before the 20th in the Senate, to say all the things he said, oh my gosh, about Donald Trump and how horrible he was and is, and then say, but the time that the House chose to bring it over. No, we didn't choose. You chose not to receive it. So I think that's really important. And again, it doesn't matter, as Jamie and others have told us. You can have the case after the person is out of office. So it's an elementary discussion. The Senate ruled in that way and honoring a precedent on this. So it didn't matter, except it was not the reason that he voted the way he did. It was the excuse that he used. And so that's why I think it's important, because that was a very important speech. So Chuck Schumer's speech was remarkable in laying it all out. I think he was inspired by all of you, because you raised the level of all of this to such a place of patriotism and knowledge of our country, our history, and what we owe our children. Again, we always say, honoring the vision of our founders, worthy of the sacrifice of our men and women in uniform, and respecting the aspirations
right
of
there.
our children. They did all
You know,
of that.
one thing that I did really like
The distinguished
earlier
manager said
is
earlier
how
in
your
this
father
presidential
defended your mom.
weekend, our sense
I
of
thought that was really cool.
patriotism is stirred, and we're called upon in a strong way.
What did you think about that?
So I want to thank them. I want to thank Stacy Poskett. Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Madeline Dean. Thank you very much, Joe Negret.
I had never seen him do that
Noel.
before.
Thank you, Dinah DeGette. Thank you, David Cicciolini.
You stood up like,
Thank you,
now
Ted
my
Lewis.
wife.
Thank you, Joaquin Castro. Thank you very much, Mr. Lee.
Oh, so you've seen that was no
leadership on
surprise to
all
you.
of this. We just couldn't be prouder. I've been hearing from my grandchildren who are very sad that justice wasn't done. But by 15 votes, the Senate voted.
Was that something that, what's his name, your ex did?
Statement about what has happened. It would not have been accomplished without your brilliant presentation. So I thank you for that, and I yield the floor back to all of you as I leave.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, thank you for your confidence in us. I was going to go next to Scott. Okay, Scott.
Interesting. What about me? Is that something I would do?
Still was liable criminally or civilly for everything he did in office. You didn't know that the Justice Department or state attorney general could pursue with legal.
He even hedged on that. Remember when he talked about incitement? He said he didn't think this rose to level. So he was hedging all over the place. I don't know whether it was for rumors or what, but whatever it was a very disingenuous speech. And I say that regretfully because I always want to be able to work with the leadership of the other party. I think our country needs a strong Republican Party. It's very important, and him to try to have it every which way. But we will be going forward to make sure that this never happens again, in terms of what we're to investigate and evaluate what caused this, and both in terms of the motivation, but also in terms of the security that we have to have as we go forward, recognizing how inflamed even some of our elected officials can be. But I defer to all these distinguished lawyers about.
All right, let's see. So,
Speaker Pelosi, is Fincher an
I'll come to you and then I'll come to you. I'm sorry.
Is Fincher an option right now? Then
Fincher is a flat or change of the Constitution that lets everybody off the hook. It lets everybody off the hook. Oh, these cowardly senators who couldn't face up to what the president did and what was at stake for our country are now going to have a chance to give a little slap on the wrist. We censure people for using stationery for the wrong purpose. We don't censure people for inciting insurrection that kills people in the Capitol.
Yes.
Explain how you went from wanting the contemporaneous notes from the Congresswoman depositions, possibly leading to other depositions, to then entering an already public statement into the trial record. Did you try and reach out to her at all? And then separately,
I'm ready.
did the White House either indirectly or directly have any
What is
involvement
that,
in the decision to call you witnesses?
Oh, shit.
You know what? I mean,
You're
I don't
right.
want to, we tried this case as a.
All right, look at this real quick. Tell me
on the law
your
and on
thoughts.
the facts. We did everything that we could. We got from the president's lawyers exactly what we wanted, which was the entering into the evidentiary record of the statement by our colleague, Congresswoman Butler. And we got that. I was able to read it before the entire country,
what's it called?
it became
Who was
part
watching last night when he was like
of
this?
the case, and it became an
With
important
the,
part of our case. If
the helicopter, he was trying to get the guy to bring it up.
witnesses, and it would not have overcome the kinds of arguments
Yeah,
being
that's
made
why I
by
said,
Mitch McConnell
because
and other
I may have
Republicans
to take the
who
reins
were
and
hanging their hats
to
on
record something.
the claim that it was somehow unconstitutional to try a
That is
former
why I
president,
something.
or that the First Amendment somehow
That's why I
gave
was
him a right to
prefacing you.
incite violent insurrection against the Union. And though, they're going to have to live with those arguments that they made. But we think that we overwhelmingly proved our case. I think Mitch McConnell's statement showed that they knew we overwhelmingly proved our case. And
I mean, it's
all
a
of
nice
it might have
flyer,
happened if we
but it makes it look like you're a part of their
bargained for
show.
10 witnesses on our side, 10 witnesses on their side. The first person they said they wanted to
what I was trying to say with
bring
this
up and
is that it's radio on fire. I didn't name myself or them.
They would have turned the
We're
whole
just
thing into a circus. And we conducted
I was trying to say, so like, who's doing the show? You can't really say who's on the show. It doesn't say Diamond Gates on the show. It doesn't say the girls who's on the show. It just says radio on fire,
on the other
this,
side,
the
and
date,
you
and the
know
place.
what Donald Trump's track
That
record
way,
is. We're
whatever
not going
has
to
to
allow them
happen
to
can
turn it
happen.
into a farce.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a point.
Because we're all going to be there, potentially. But this doesn't tell you what exactly is going to happen. It just says something and listen on the station.
The state, at least the first time that I saw the statement was yesterday. It was released. That statement
Yeah,
was
I mean,
released
you're
yesterday.
right. If you do it like that,
So-
Because I gotta put my name. That's why I put my name on it or their name.
But what's interesting is that the premise
We'll
of some of these
see
questions is
what's gonna
somehow
happen.
that we failed to prove the facts of the case. I think in the eyes of the
where does
entire
Mia
world
live?
in the country,
Like,
we
you don't even know where she lives
overwhelmingly
in
proved the
Atlanta,
facts.
No, I think she said that she
And
lives
Senator
in
McConnell just
Marietta.
conceded that wasn't the issue.
how far is that away from?
And then you got to talk to the 43
From where
senators
this is?
who are basically saying no
Nowhere,
amount of
probably
facts would have made
about,
any difference to them
15
because
minutes,
they
like
didn't
from
think
here
that the
to Plaza.
president was subject to the jurisdiction of the Senate.
Come on,
That was
bro.
the argument you just heard Mitch McConnell make. So forgive me for reacting strongly to that, but that seems to me to be a completely bizarre conclusion to these events, to say that somehow if we had just had one more witness, Mitch McConnell would have come over to our side. Just listen to his words. Yes.
And I think that's how it should be. I think that's one of the benefits of having so many people.
I never spoke to anyone from the White House or to President Biden or to Vice President Harris. None of them. No. And I made the call. So you want to blame somebody?
They never were before.
Yeah.
It would always be one that says that hang all the time.
Well, remember, when you get in a situation like this, if we had needed any witnesses to make our case, then we would have gone all the way and insisted on witnesses in a 6-week trial or an 8-week trial or whatever. We didn't. We overwhelmingly proved our case. Senator McConnell, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, just conceded that. Right? All of them are saying, well, you won on the facts. Yeah. So.
You said something. It was two things that we had to do, right? We had to first have a motion for witnesses, which we did when we were supposed to do it, which was after the prosecution and the defense made their case. We made a motion to allow for witnesses, and then after that, we requested one witness. The Republican counsel for the president, the former president, said he was going to bring 100 witnesses. We got the essence of what we wanted, which was the statement of Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler. The defense got nothing. And I think that what you're doing is making a lot out of and dismissing the incredible evidence of havoc, mayhem, and what this president had done over a period of months to bring destruction to our democracy by talking about if you had 2 or 3 more witnesses, what was going to happen.
One thing I would just add to it is remember, there's a reason that the request for witnesses comes at the conclusion of the case. Because we had an opportunity to see the former president's counsel and decide whether we needed to provide additional witnesses. Don't forget, our case was filled with dozens of witnesses who were presented by way of video and statements and recordings. And it was only last night we learned about this new information. And we got the best of both worlds. We got that testimony in the record before the jury without any risk associated with it. And that's important to remember. This is a congresswoman who repeats a telephone call between Kevin McCarthy and the former president of the United States, in which Kevin McCarthy is pleading for help, saying, help us, we're under attack. The president first tries to blame another group, Antifa, and he says, no, Mr. President, these are your supporters, and we're in danger here. And he says, well, Kevin, maybe they care more about the election than you do. That came before the Senate jury through the statement that Mr. Raskin read. So we got the evidence in of the witness that we wanted to present, and that was a victory for us.
President Donald John Trump was let off on a technicality.
What made her do that? She don't
And
normally
that's
do that.
essentially what you heard Mitch McConnell say, that they let him off on what they perceived at least to be a procedural issue, which was because of the constitutionality of the matter, they couldn't proceed to the substance. Doctrinal interpretation, both on the liberal side and the conservative side, strongly disagrees with that assessment, but they let him off on a technicality.
Right.
And you also heard Mitch McConnell go up there and say, essentially, that we overwhelmingly proved our case.
Right.
That substantively, Donald Trump is guilty of inciting an insurrection.
That is what you said.
And it has been, I know for all of us, an honor to work and a solemn honor to work on this case. And even though we didn't get 67 votes, this has been the most bipartisan vote for impeachment and conviction ever. And we know that we spoke the truth on the Senate floor. And the American people, by and large, have agreed with us. And one final remark on all of this, this episode from January 6th on has been very taxing on the American people.
Without objection. Now, I ask unanimous consent that the Secretary be authorized to include statements of senators explaining their votes either given or submitted during the legislative sessions of the Senate through March 1st, along with the full record of the Senate's proceedings and the filings by the parties in a Senate document printed under the supervision of the Secretary of the Senate that will complete the documentation of the Senate's handling of these impeachment proceedings.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Res 62 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 62, congratulating the Tampa.
61.
Senate Resolution 61, honoring the life, achievements, and legacy of the Honorable George Pratt Schultz.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
Ardennois. I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent, Madam President, that the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Res 62 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 62, congratulating the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the loyal fans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers for becoming Super Bowl 55 champions.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding the upcoming adjournment of the Senate, the President of the Senate, the President pro the TEM and the majority and minority leaders be authorized to make appointments to commissions, committees, boards, conferences, or interparliamentary conferences authorized by law by concurrent action of the two houses or by order of the Senate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent on Friday, February 19th, from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Committees be authorized to report legislative and executive matters.
Without objection.
President, I have unanimous consent that the appointment at the desk appears second in the record as if made by the chair.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that at time determined on Tuesday, February 23rd, notwithstanding Rule 22, the Senate proceed to executive session and the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Thomas J. Vilsack to be Secretary of Agriculture. Further, that there be 20 minutes for debate equally divided between the two leaders or the designees, and that the Senate vote without intervening action or debate on the nomination, and that if confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 10.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I send a cloture.
Clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of State, Linda Thomas Greenfield of Louisiana to be the representative of the United States of America to the United Nations and the representatives of the United States of America in the Security Council of the United Nations.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the standing rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on calendar number 10, Linda Thomas Greenfield of Louisiana to be the representative of the United States of America to the United Nations with the rank and status of the Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary and the representative of the United States of America in the Security Council of the United Nations, signed by 18 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion's agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 11.
Question is on the motion. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes have it. Motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
A nomination, Department of State, Linda Thomas Greenfield of Louisiana to be representative of the United States of America to the sessions of the General Assembly of the United Nations.
Where am I? I'm lost. Motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the standing rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on calendar number 11, Linda Thomas Greenfield of Louisiana to be representative of the United States of America to the sessions of the General Assembly of the United Nations, signed by 18 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that following the reading of Washington's farewell address on Monday, Feb. 22, the Senate resume consideration of calendar number 10, that the cloture motions ripen at 5:30 on Monday, February 22nd, and finally, that the mandatory quorum calls for the cloture motions filed today, February 13th, be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate resume legislative session.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, that it adjourn to then convene for pro forma sessions only, with no business being conducted on the following dates and times, that the following each pro forma session, the Senate adjourn until the next pro forma session, Tuesday, February 16th at 10 a.m., Friday, February 19th at 10:15 a.m. I further ask that when the Senate adjourns on Friday, February 19th, it next convene at 3 p.m., Monday, February 22nd. Further, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and Senator Portman be recognized to deliver Washington's farewell address as provided under the previous order, and that following his remarks, morning business be closed, the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the Thomas Greenfield nomination as provided under the previous order.
Without objection.
If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask it stand adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until February 16th at 10 a.m.
And with that, the Senate has adjourned their business for the day after voting 57-43 to acquit the former president on one charge of inciting an insurrection on Congress on January 6th. The votes were 10 shy of the 67 they needed to find the former president guilty. Your reaction to the trial and the vote coming up. Republicans 202-748-8921.
Manager's presentation, everything that happened here at the Capitol on January 6th, and of course had to sit in the chamber to see pictures of it having been ransacked while they sat at their very desks. But again, this announcement from McConnell likely really closes any window that there may have been or idea that former President Trump might be convicted, Joe. The other thing I will add is that we're dealing with this morning is, and there's Mitch McConnell now walking from his office to the Senate floor. We are dealing with a question about witnesses because of some new information that came out overnight from Kevin McCarthy. So we're about to find out right now if something unexpected is going to happen on that front.
Yeah, that is sort of the big question that remains this morning. Will we see witnesses? If we don't have witnesses, how do we expect things to move forward today?
And I'd ask the Sergeant at Arms to make a proclamation.
So I think they're about to make the proclamation, Joe. I think we ought to just listen in here because if this starts as quickly as we expect, we're going to go straight to these final closing arguments and then, of course, to the final vote.
Against Donald John Trump, former president of the United States.
And pursuant to the provisions of Senate Resolution 47, the Senate has provided up to 2 hours of argument by the parties, equally divided, on the question of whether or not there shall be an order to consider and debate under the impeachment rules any motion to subpoena witnesses or documents. Are both parties ready to proceed at this point?
He said they are ready to proceed.
They may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Senators. Over the last several days, we presented overwhelming evidence that establishes the charges in the article of impeachment. We've shown you how President Trump created a powder keg, lit a match, and then continued his incitement even as he failed to defend us from the ensuing violence. We've supported our position with images, videos, affidavits, documents, tweets, and other evidence, leaving no doubt that the Senate should convict. We believe we've proven our case. But last night, Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler of Washington State issued a statement confirming that in the middle of the insurrection, when House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy called the president to beg for help, President Trump responded, and I quote, "Well, Kevin, I guess these people are more upset about the election than you are." Needless to say, this is an additional critical piece of corroborating evidence, further confirming the charges before you, as well as the president's willful dereliction of duty and desertion of duty as Commander-in-Chief of the United States, his state of mind, and his further incitement of the insurrection on January 6th. For that reason, and because this is the proper time to do so under the resolution that the Senate adopted to set the rules for the trial, we would like the opportunity to subpoena Congresswoman Herrera regarding her communications with House
Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and to subpoena her contemporaneous notes that she made regarding what President Trump told Kevin McCarthy in the middle of the insurrection. We would be prepared to proceed with a Zoom deposition of an hour or less,
Do you think that
just as soon as Congresswoman Herrera Butler is available, and to then proceed to the next phase of the trial, including the introduction of that testimony shortly thereafter. Congresswoman Butler further stated that she hopes other witnesses to this part of the story, other patriots, as she put it, would come forward. And if that happens, we would seek the opportunity to take their depositions via Zoom, also for less than an hour, or to subpoena other relevant documents as well.
Mr. President, thank you. Senators, good morning. And good morning to the American people. The first thing I want to say on the issue of witnesses is that the House manager just got up here and described the articles of impeachment and the charges. There is no plural here. That's wrong. There's one article of impeachment and there's one charge, and that's incitement of violence and insurrection. What you all need to know and the American people need to know is, as of late yesterday afternoon, there was a stipulation going around that there weren't going to be any witnesses. But after what happened here in this chamber yesterday, the House managers realized they did not investigate this case before bringing the impeachment. They did not give the proper consideration and work. They didn't put the work in that was necessary to impeach the former president.
All right, now one last thing. Do you think that outline on the word stream,
If they want to have witnesses,
equal to that? The stream is emphasized.
I'm going to need at least over 100 depositions, not just one. The real issue is incitement. They put into their case over 100 witnesses, people who have been charged with crimes by the federal government. And each one of those, they said that Mr. Trump was a co-conspirator with. That's not true. But I have the right to defend that. The only thing that I ask, if you vote for witnesses, do not handcuff me.